The first panel is going to be all about agent tooling. It's going to be moderated by Denise Tang, who you've already met as my co-MC today. Denise is a partner at Gradient Ventures, investing in early-stage B2B AI companies. Before venture, she was a product manager at Meta, Twitter, and MuleSoft, where she built products in MLOps, data infrastructure, and analytics. Today, she spends most of her time working with founders on shaping AI-native products and go-to-market strategies. And we've got three great panelists today. Sean Roberts is VP of Applied AI at Netlify, where I used to work for a little while. He's been in web development for 2 decades. He enjoys vibe coding and skateboarding with his son and daughter. Prakul Agarwal is a senior product manager for AI and ML at MongoDB, leading innovations in vector search, LLM, and agentic frameworks. Before MongoDB, he built ML infrastructure at Amazon's Zoox, where he earned a US patent. He also drove cloud products at Salesforce and founded WeGroove, an AI music startup using deep learning for real-time music recommendations. Our final panelist is Brian Holt. He's a member of product staff at Neon, which is now part of Databricks. He has an illustrious career in the database world with product roles at Snowflake and SQLite. Before his current role, he is also an instructor at Front-End Masters.
Well, hey everyone, it's me again. And I am very excited to have this panel discussion because as an investor, I always want to know what are the key tooling to enable agents. And I think one thing to make agents really helpful is it can access the real world data. And by doing that, agents can actually create the meaningful use case that aligns with the business context or whatever use cases the user is looking for. So jump right into the first questions I have. So how are we seeing in the data layer, like vector search or retrieval API, context engineering, agent memory, and more? What's breaking, what's working, and what might be the new functionalities specifically designed for the agents? I think this can be interesting questions. Maybe start with the data people from the panel. Prakul, do you want to start?
I can start. So I think one thing is memory for AI agents is emerging to be the most important differentiators. This is going to be the year of memory. The whole discussions around context engineering having moved away from prompt engineering. So the memory is the core thing. And with that, I think one thing that's changing is thinking about your database, your OLTP, OLAP, separate from your vector store, separate from your AI store. So in some ways, there's a convergence. As you think through building a gradually sophisticated agent, you need to be able to take care of things like I want my agent to know the most real-time data. Mm-hmm. But it's also important that it is tied into the source of truth. Things change. I get the latest data. It's also tied into the identity and security. So that it's not something, these things can't be working in isolation. Mm-hmm. I think that's one big thing that's changing. And we increasingly hear developers thinking about, okay, this is my AI memory. How do I build it? How do I go around doing that? So one way thing is I think the whole piece around ETLs and moving things around, having segmented view between these different systems is something that's breaking down. Now with the reasoning models and the reasoning agents, it's also important that you don't just provide that data in one go. It is something that each step of your reasoning needs to have, and things need to be shared. So you're essentially building about how do I manage this data? What is it that I need to retrieve fresh? What is it that I need to actually store for subsequent processing? And what is it that I need to be deleting as I progress? So that's, I think, the big shift in data tooling from my perspective.
Interesting. Brian, kind of curious if you have any thoughts from Databricks or Neon.
Oh, I have lots of thoughts.
Please.
I think exactly what he was saying is really putting it, nailing it. The part that we're seeing a lot of interesting in just from the developer and the agentic experience kind of perspective of it. Thank you, Netlify, for coining that term. Is that if you give these agents kind of all these you have this in memory, you have this in database, you have this in the analytic pool, and you just try and say okay, now go figure it out, right? They never do, right? Or they come back with stale data, or they come back with they pulled from the wrong data source or something that's been cached incorrectly. And so just reducing the surface area, reducing it down to like a retrieve tool, something like that, or a skill for retrieving something from like your general data pool, has been super successful, at least for some of my clients, which are agentic code makers. Like at Neon, we launched a MCP server like 10 days after MCP was announced. And like our first one was kind of a mess, so it had like lots of APIs and all that kind of stuff. And what was fun is we had, 20, 30, 40 tools or something like that, as everyone did at some point, right? And continually these agents would just keep using the SQL tool. Just like, we had them for like these like nice migrations that would craft and it would be beautiful and all that kind of stuff, and it was never called, right? Like it was just like, no, raw SQL all the time and just send it, and it wasn't pulling out of like the right data store sometimes, it was like definitely avoiding all the handcrafted deterministic code that we had. So that's been like the trend, and like the more successful patterns that I've seen is like we've reduced down tools to like 2, right? Like he's like, go get this for me. And then like someone this morning was talking about sub agents, right? And like, I think it was the Sentry guy, like delegating this down to a specialist that's actually able to go and retrieve these things, that you don't have to burden your agent with that kind of context.
Interesting. And Sean, curious if you have any thoughts here too, even though you guys don't directly build the storage or database,
Right.
but any observation here?
We're on the other side of it, where we're trying to figure out how to fit all these pieces in and try to provide a good developer experience. And the thing that I'm really excited for us to like finally, it feels like we're finally starting to figure out like what David was saying, and like reducing the number of tools and things. But there's you were talking about having the latest, most fresh data. Like what we're finding is that's really relative and very specific to a very specific point in time, use case, environment, all these things. And so like, these systems have to get better and better. To give an example on this, on your side, it's like, hey, the LLM was trained on version 1 of the SDK. The latest version is version 3, but my customer's on version 2. And like giving them relevant context and narrowing that down is very specific to their situation. And like we were kind of like, okay, starting with just the LLM, and that was fine. And then we overshot, and it's like, now you get the latest documentation, that's also not useful. And then like getting more specialized is where I'm really anxious to see us go in the industry.
Very interesting. A quick follow-up here. If, let's say there's some team over here, first time building AI agents, what might be the most kind of minimum viable data stack or data tooling you guys recommend the team to adopt? Would that always be, vector database related, retrieval API? Kind of curious what might be the top picks.
I've actually signed a blood pact that I have to say Postgres. I was just go up in flames if I don't say anything otherwise. No, I mean like, but I'll say like anyone's like MongoDB is also a great product for something like this as well. Like you need like a really good, I'm gonna say OLTP database, or just like something of that nature. Because there's so many great plugins and tools around it, whether that's something like, we have PG Mooncake now. I think Snowflake launched PG Lake, right? So that you can kind of like back yourself into like a full data story. But starting simple, starting small, starting like with a really small surface area, and then discovering the problems that you have and growing out your stack from there. Reducing surface areas for agents is like, I'm probably just gonna repeat that a lot, is like, I have found to be the most successful way to have more success more quickly on a smaller budget.
Got it.
Yeah, so from my perspective, 3 things, right? One is an OLTP database, that's your source of truth. The second thing is a vector search, or more essentially like a hybrid search that can allow you to do full text search, semantic search with filters. And the third thing is like a blob store, just to be able to store raw context that you want to process and put into one of these systems for your agent to make sense. Now, probably like I think that would be my thing, that start simple and then gradually expand. Don't build a lake house from the get-go. Really
what? Use Databricks. That's not
just kidding. Yes, but I think that's the main thing. But yeah, thinking about things like observability as you build this data sources, I think is critical. Because with agents, you're looking at multi-tenant data access, and you're looking at like that's the security kind of a bottleneck in some ways in terms of, in enterprises, at least getting an approval for a use case to go into production. That's been a bottleneck. If you can't have that good governance and traceability around what data is going where, that's a problem.
Yeah. The last time when I heard, I know Mastra has a really great observability function there, so definitely.
Yeah,
sounds cool.
Nice job.
Awesome. Well, I want to switch the direction a little bit to the overall tooling needed for the agents experience, right? I think Netlify actually coined this term, AX, the agent experience. So it's essentially talking about, enable the agents to work with tools, workflows, contents, and interact with the systems, reliably and autonomously. So I guess the key questions here is, we have like framework, runtime, and hosting layer, observability and debugging tools, things like that. And you also briefly mentioned security. So what are the critical developer tools nowadays beyond just data that we need to enable agent experience?
I think the most important reason why we kind of wanted to step up one category and call this as an umbrella term, like agent experience, is because I think for a while we were getting really caught up in, you just need an MCP or you just need LLM's text, like whoever uses that. And like, it got conflated, like this is how this is how agents work with you. And the reality is, it's like, MCP only matters if someone actually has your MCP server installed. LLM's text only matters if if the agents actually use it. And so the reality is all of those are very valuable. But what you first need to do is step back and say, who are my users, right? Because agents are just these systems that are acting on their behalf, and you're not narrowing in on like, hey, we want agents to be the successful party here. We want the end user who happens to be delegating work through agents to be successful. And who those users are, like David said earlier, we target developers, so they care about developer tools. So does Netlify. We care about using Cursor and Windsurf, all like any sort of developer tool. We want to be there, and then it comes down to what things do they support. Do they support MCP? Do they support prompts in MCP? Do they support all these things? And the reality is like there's no one way to do it, but the same practices of what we were doing with the user experience side of things, where we say, this is our users, this is how they use us, these are the entry points in which they come to us, and then really being, auditing that and saying, hey, this is what this tool does. If we did this, we were really able to reach out to them, just like they did. Like, so we provide MCP, turns out the MCP is, didn't work as well as we thought, and we're going to iterate on that, like that iteration loop, and actually working still with humans, still with your end customers, and prioritizing, hey, you wanted to use this flow. This is how we validate whether or not it's working for you, and then we iterate on that. And so it's going to look like MCP, maybe this new versions of MCP where it's like code modes, things like that, are the new way of doing it. Because at the end of the day, we're all also playing in the same sandbox. So if I have an MCP server and they're using Neon and also Mongo or whatever, and there's 300 tools or something in there, and then like
nobody's happy.
Cursor, and then Cursor falls over at 50 or something. It's like, you really have to think about the holistic picture of it. So that's kind of a broad answer, but like there's no one way to do it. But it's that practice of figuring out who your users are, being disciplined about that, figuring out what tools they're using, and then going from there and iterating over time.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
As I've been building agentic tools, and like over the past year and a half, I've been doing it. I started as like DX and AX are very different things, and over time I realized like they become closer and closer. And at some point, like I was like, oh, the Venn diagram is a circle. And then as I've been going a little bit further, like there's strong overlap, but there is some difference. Like a good example would be like rate limiting, right? Like you want to rate limit your developers, but like you really probably don't want to rate limit your agents, or like at least it looks very different, right?
Yeah.
So it's like this. You need to figure out this way to tolerate non-determinism in a deterministic way, because like these agents are chaotic. They have, like people mess with the temperature, and they'll try all sorts of weird things, and they'll use tools in ways that they're like unconventional, but still might work, right? And so this is why we get into like evals, right? And evals become really important, and so like I hope if you're doing agentic things, like it's like top of mind. It's like we need to figure out like how to get like really good observability and evals into our stack.
Yeah. I think to add to those two great points, one thing is obviously you need a very good framework and a runtime that can allow you to implement those best practices. Mastra comes to mind. The second thing is, which is often my point, like we have been looking at a lot of AI agents, and it's a information retrieval problem. So two tools that are important to have a good information retriever are embedding models and your re-ranker models. So as we go in the domain of your agent figuring out which tools to call, which data source to pick, which API to call, into that like adaptive context engineering domain, it's really important that it is able to retrieve the best tools and best data sources for the job. So that's something that's been critical.
That makes sense. And my last question, also as an investor, always very curious, what are the production use cases you guys actually see a lot from maybe your clients in terms of like, hey, agents running in production with a lot of usage or versus just a demo? So kind of curious, any pattern you notice in terms of a use case that already mature enough to adopt agent? Any examples you guys observed?
Well, we support a bunch of AI coding agents.
Coding
so
agent,
like
for sure.
we end up being on the other side. Like generating code is is amazing. However, just having code on your computer isn't very valuable. So like Netlify ends up being the side where they deploy things to and ship it to production, and that's where we see most of our use cases. And it becomes really niche where it's like, hey, we're like, a healthcare thing, and we're going to allow people to build a little bit, but it still needs to be hosted and then sandboxed or whatever it is. And so we see a lot of those use cases of just like using the generative AI side of things to progress some user experience. Sometimes it's the full experience, sometimes it's just a micro part, and then we help run that. So we see that a lot.
Coding, interesting.
And maybe to add to that, I think there is definitely code tends to be the ones which are actually moving to production. So apart from like developer-focused tools, there is this whole code modernization of legacy enterprises. I think that's been a use case we've been seeing some scaled usage
like
of.
code refactoring.
Code refactoring in an agent, essentially taking an application and converting into, let's say, microservices, writing tests which may not be existing, running and iterating end to end. The other thing I think it's interesting in just customer service, I think is pretty common, and that's been seeing a lot of growth. Wherever there is no critical outcome base, like where there can be a human in the loop, it can act as an assistant. Those are the use cases which are going into production. Rather than the agent doing things autonomously and also taking the behalf, those tends to be more risky. So for instance, just in healthcare, a lot of like doctor office operations, which would require a specialist, generating the notes, writing a diagnosis, building insurance compliance, those kinds of use cases are actually going to production because there's a human that can vet the outcome of what the agent is doing.
Yeah, I think I see people starting out with like these like big models like Opus and like giving it lots of freedom and just like kind of playing like in this like discovery mode. And then I'll watch people like take those and like launch them, and they're like slow, they're expensive, they do weird things, right? And so I see the pattern that I see these people is they take these like really like open kind of use cases, and they'll start like narrowing it down further and further, and like by the end, like where they're happy with it, it's like a very tiny model with lots of constraints on it, doing very specific things that are then being checked afterwards, either by the human in the loop or like a LLM as a judge or something like that. Like that's where everybody ends up. Like they're like, I want it to be able to do anything. It's like, oh, I want it to do nothing. Just this very small use case.
Sounds like a coding agent's more mature, same for customer support related, and for the other use cases is more on the micro workflow at this stage. Interesting. Well, that's the core questions I want to ask from the panelists. I want to open up for the audience for 2 questions. Anyone has any question? For deployments, agents, I kind of saw him. All right, the gentleman over there in blue.
They're coming.
The microphone is coming.
The mic comes for us all.
Hi, guys. The AX UXD Venn diagram thing, I don't know. Could you just say a little more about how you think that's developing and where it's going? Yeah.
Yeah, so like as far as like how it's developing, I mean, I think every bit of what we're doing here is like progress towards that, like what the Anthropic's doing, what everyone is doing in order to not just to make great agents, but those agents need to be connecting with the outside world. And the industry itself is exploring various different protocols and means of doing that, right? But at the end of the day, right, the thing that we had seen emerging and dubbed AX, which, regardless of what you call it, I mean, the practice is like, hey, it's not a question of whether or not agents are using your product. They are. The question is whether or not they're successful at doing that, right? And, the way I think about the importance of that is like, as we know, very early web, at some point in time, if you didn't have a website, you were no longer relevant. And then search engines became the way people discovered things. And so if you didn't start ranking well on search engines, you became irrelevant. And as agents and these different AI systems become a very important, probably not the end-all be-all entry point to the web, but if you don't have a great agent experience and a way for them to discover you and work with you well, you're going to become irrelevant because they do at some point store internal state, how they have preferences, they understand some levels of things, from their training. And so that's the call to action, like making sure you do that. And then the discipline itself is just like figuring that out over time. And I think we're all trying to do it. MCP is a good example of it. LLM's text was a good early example. What's up?
Are you using any like theoretical structure to like human-machine communication or CMC or any kind of thing from academia, theoretical, to help think through that?
I think the basis of all this stuff is really, at least from our explorations, is overrides a lot of what UX patterns were. It was like at the end of the day, like what he was saying, like this overlap between DX and UX, DX and AX is really kind of the same. What it really is on the DX front, like we serve developers. So we're trying to provide a great developer experience. And AX is just an extension of that because what we're saying there is we want to support the developers who are using agents as well. So it all goes back to that. So all I have to say is like there's no answer for this that like we can specifically point to, but there is a massive amount of design practice and iteration practice to kind of study the success of these things. And then we're also creating new tools, such as like, we see this a lot in the little geo space or the AI SEO stuff, where it's like, hey, like I'm gonna try this, and evaluate whether or not the agent was successful at doing that. And we can really automate that and use it as a judge to figure out how to optimize those. So there's actually better tools that we can do that we couldn't really do with UX exactly, because unlike humans and usability tests, the agent will just be there and we can test it as long as we want, and they're not going to get tired or whatever. So I think that's the new opportunity, is the ability to optimize it and put tooling in front of it. Just builds on all the theoretical and the discipline that we had with UX, but now we can actually automate a lot of it as well.
One more questions towards the end of that first role. Thank you.
Hey, I had a quick question. You were mentioning, this iterative approach of improving the models, right? So I think, when working with engineering, also management, right? There's an expectation that you go from point A to point B. It should always be consistent. And as we've seen with LLMs, right? There's always like that 5%, 10% gap where things go wrong. And when you have a customer, right? I think that when they use ChatGPT or any of these other tools, they're always willing to kind of guide the model, right? And I think that there's also a perspective of like how much you're paying for these things. If you're paying a lot for a product, you expect it to work consistently. So to your point, right? We had a big model, we started shrinking it. What are you guys doing in terms of, I know that there's a whole other talk you can have about taking outputs and then using it to proactively improve your progress. But how are you guys kind of handling the reliability aspect, right? As people are improving parts of your prompts that worked really well before, adding capabilities, how do you ensure that you're still maintaining that, higher level of reliability in a consistent way, like CI or?
It's a great question. I think the most simple, perhaps frustrating answer to give is like, you need to know what is right and what is wrong, right? Because I see a lot of people going into these problems and just being like, I'm just gonna like YOLO and just see what comes out of this, and like stuff will come out of it and like it'll be right-ish, right? But that's how you start. That's the discovery process, and I fear too many people stop there, right? You need to have like a clear idea. It's like, I have these inputs and I'm expecting this output. Once you have that like framework of like what you find correct and what you find incorrect, at that point you can really start setting up some rigor around figuring out, like, and this comes back to evals again, right? Of like, given this input, I expect this to have this kind of output, and I have this kind of tolerance for the oscillation here. And like, if you put in that work, if you set up these testing frameworks, and if you have clear expectations with your management or your company and your clients and yourself, then at that point everyone's kind of on the same page of like, hey, this is going to work 85% of the time. We need human in the loops here, here, and here, and we need these kind of like feedback loops for us to kind of figure out like where things are going right and where things are going wrong. Then at that point you have a pretty good framework of like a point to start iterating toward your final goals.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, like, I think eval-driven development for AI agents can't be overstated enough. So once you have that idea of an end objective, and you said you're trying to push in that, like squeezing in that last 20%, 10% accuracy that your agent is not doing, I think that's where some of the being able to have some kind of a tracing observability comes into picture, because inherently this is a non-deterministic process, right? The autonomous agent is gonna take you down different paths. So different runs will have that in a different order, right? Like, so in this way, it's kind of having that tracing observability, and then essentially being able to figure out how to improve there. In our use cases that I work with customers on, it comes down to what they fit in the context. Just having a larger context does not mean you should be using it. It actually, if you don't structure it properly, it will bring down the things. So being able to have that observability and be able to audit like, what was the right information that could have been pulled in? How do you improve that retrieval accuracy? So having some scores around like recall precision on your context window and how you're feeding that, apart from having a separate eval, is something that we are seeing to emerge more, because that's where the accuracy of your AI agent is going to come in.
The one thing I would add there is like, you do need to start with like a measure of something worked right. Like someone was able to go from they prompted something and this is the ideal outcome, and be able to quantitatively measure that, and then allowing your users to use these agents and try those things and get actually a baseline score, because the reality is many people they're always going to have this like too ambiguous or too ambitious type of prompts, and you don't really need to optimize for those, but you really need to figure out what those things look like in terms of how they translate to end results. And then what we found that really works is, in addition to optimizing the best chance for those to be successful, is to actually at prompt time or when they're about to do something, encourage them when we detect that, hey, you come to Netlify and you're like, make me an app. And it's like, okay, like it's gonna try, but like it's probably, who knows if it's gonna really do well, and any agent's gonna be that way. Or they're like, here's this epic thing, I want you to do 50 different things in this amount of quality, and the agents end up overloading their own context and such. And so what we have found to work well is like, hey, we should probably actually help them and say, hey, this is way too much, or this is like, we have no idea where you're gonna go with this, and encourage people more into that happy medium, and to help them help themselves. And again, seeing that end result go up based off of that is how you need to measure it at the end of the day.
Well, thank you so much for the panelists for all the detailed answer here. And Sean, Prakul, and Brian will be available during lunchtime. So if you have more questions, please feel free to reach us then. That's the wrap for the panel. Please give them a round of applause.